Hello everyone. This demonstration is going to be of the next seam in our series for our seam hem sampler, and this seam is going to be the French seam. So the French seam is a seam within a seam, and on the wrong side of the fabric this is what it looks like. It's a nice clean finish that we get on the wrong side of the fabric, and on the correct side of the fabric it looks like our regular seam. So how do we go about doing this seam? Once again, we have our instructions in our notes. So we have the French seam, and the instructions are: number one, to thread trace a 1-inch seam allowance. Then pin along the seam line with the wrong sides of the fabric together. So once again, we're putting the wrong sides of the fabric together as we did in the flat felled seam in our previous seam that we constructed. And then we're going to machine stitch 1/4 inch from that thread traced line with our two pieces of fabric together, wrong sides of the fabric together, and we're stitching that 1/4 inch machine stitch in the seam allowance area. Then we're going to trim the seam down to about 1/8 of an inch from that stitching line. We're going to press our stitch, embedding the machine stitching into the fabric, and then we're going to press the seam open so that we can get the full allotment of the seam before we do our final stitching. Then we're going to make the seam final stitch with the two correct sides of the fabric facing one another, and then we're going to press it and turn the seam in one direction or the other, and of course remove the thread tracing. So that's how we're going to do the seam, and we'll get started. And the first step, so that we know what our seam allowance is that we will be doing our thread trace line. So if you recall how we do a thread trace, I am not going to put a knot in my needle in my thread because I'm going to be removing it. I did mark on my piece of muslin here that I'm going to be using. I have a chalk mark that indicates where the stitching line is going to be, and I am going to take 2 small stitches, and then I'm going to take a large stitch about 1 inch, and then I'm going to take 2 small stitches again, pick up 1, and then the next one is going to be moving along, creating the inch stitch. I'm doing this on what would be the wrong side of the fabric, so I have my grain line marked, and my other line marked here with the chalk is on the wrong side, so that I can see my thread trace on the correct side of the fabric. So I'll just move along with this, pick up a small stitch, come through, go through the fabric again, and pick up a large stitch, pick up a small stitch, go through the fabric and pick up a large stitch, and then again pick up a small stitch, go through the fabric, and here I am at the end of it. And so that is my thread trace. And so that's what it looks like on the wrong side of the fabric, and that's what it looks like on the correct side of the fabric. So I have my thread trace line in place. I'm going to add this to the stitches that I've already completed on the sampler. So I have my stitch in pink, and I have my tailored edge, and I have my flat felled seam. And so the next one that I'm adding here is going to be for the French seam. So the last piece that I have on my sampler is this piece of brown fabric, and the instructions here for the French seam say to put the two wrong sides of the fabric together. So here's my muslin piece, and this is the wrong side of the muslin piece. So I'm putting the two wrong sides of the fabric together, and I'm going to put some pins into the fabric so that I can hold these together. So I have my fabric pinned. And I know where my stitching line is because my thread tracing is indicating where the stitching line is. And my first row of stitching is going to be 1/4 of an inch into the seam allowance past that thread tracing. So if I need to mark that with a ruler, then I can get a better sense of where that is. And that's going to be my machine stitching line, right where that pencil mark is. Okay, so I'm going to take this over to the machine and I'm going to stitch in my first row of machine stitching to work on this seam. So I'll see you at the machine. Okay, so here I am at the machine. I'm ready to do that first row of stitching on the French seam on the 1/4 inch line that has been marked past the thread trace line that I put into the muslin. So here we go, stitching this. Raise up my needle, pick up my foot, allow some thread to get released, and so I have my stitching line 1/4 of an inch away from my thread trace line, and now I am ready to go to the next step with this seam allowance. And I'll meet you back at the table. Okay, so here we are with our thread trace line, which is here, and our stitching line, that's 1/4 of an inch into the seam allowance past our thread trace line. Since I have a row of machine stitching on here already, now I can remove my pins. And the next piece of instruction that we have is to trim both pieces of the seam allowance about 1/8 of an inch past our first row of stitching. So I'm going to use my ruler again. I'm going to measure about 1/8 of an inch past that row of stitching and just give myself a guideline there, and then I can just trim off the rest of that seam. So I'm going to cut it off. And if you want to leave yourself a little bit of a memory of what you've done, you can leave yourself some seam allowance there so that you know what you've trimmed off. But here's what I've trimmed from my brown fabric. That is one of my pieces that I'm working with, and the other is the muslin fabric. So that's what I've trimmed off. And now I'm going to press this so that I embed the stitches, and also I'm going to press the seam open. So my first thing is to press and embed my stitching, my machine stitching into the fabric. And then I'm going to open this seam allowance. So just kind of separate each piece here. Maybe a little difficult with the 1/8 of an inch seam, but open the seam allowance to its fullest amount. Give it a finger press, and then a press with the iron. And what we're looking at right now is the correct side of the fabric. So when we normally sew a seam, we put the correct side to the correct side, and that's what we're going to do now. The first step with this seam, though, was to put the wrong side to the wrong side and do that stitching. So correct side to correct side, now that we have the seam fully opened, correct side to correct side, so the muslin is now going on top of the brown fabric, and I'm going to get that seam right on the edge. So I have brown on one side and muslin on the other side, and when I look at the muslin, I don't see the brown. When I look at the brown, I don't see the muslin, and now I can pin my seam in place and prepare it for the final row of stitching. So get it nice right on the edge. We'll put a couple of pins in here. And then we're going to bring this back to the machine, and I'm going to sew not on top of my thread tracing line, because then it's going to be difficult to get my thread tracing out. I'm going to sew it just a little bit past the thread tracing line to complete this stitch. So that's what we have here right now. So I'm going to go back to the machine and complete the French seam. So I will see you at the machine. Okay, so now I'm back at the machine and ready to do my final stitch, which should be about 1/4 of an inch wide. So again, if I use the edge of the foot and line it up with the edge of the fabric here, then my stitch should be about 1/4 of an inch wide, which is what I would like my final width to be on this seam. So I have pins in here that I'm going to be taking out as I'm moving along. And down here I have a little bit of the memory of how I started this before I trimmed everything off, so I'm not going to go all the way down with the stitching line here. I'm just going to stop about 1 inch before the end. And I'll lift up my needle and my foot and clip my thread. And so I have my 1/4 inch stitch, and I didn't go over my thread tracing stitch, so I can pull that out easily enough. And so I'll go back to the table to press this in place and have my seam neatly finished. Okay, I'll see you back at the table. Okay, so once again we have our seam finished here, and I'm just going to clip another one of these threads. As I mentioned, I'm going to take out the thread tracing, so because it's done its job and I don't need it here anymore, so that comes out easily enough. So here's what the seam looks like on the correct side, and here's what the seam looks like on the inside of the fabric. So it's a very nice, neat finish that you can do. If you're not going to fully line a jacket, I've seen jackets where French seams were employed on the center back lining, or center back seams on jackets where the lining was not a full lining on the back of the jacket. So we have that done. Now I'll remove my board, and I can give this seam a pressing. And then generally seams are sent to the back of a garment, so send it in one direction or the other, and give it a press again. And there we have our French seam. A nice, beautiful seam. The French should be proud of it. Thank you.